In some ways, this video is a response to a recent level cap video in which he complained of the lack of progression in Battlefield 1, and by extension expressed some concerns regarding Battlefield 1's longevity. In this video, I also plan on bringing in a small little discussion on Battlefield and competitive in this context, because competitive and game longevity are usually pretty closely related. Now, before we get to all the arguments, I'd want to first address why longevity is needed in a game. In other words, why would EA or DICE care about game lifespan in the first place? To be honest, the statement that EA just wants our money and they want a bunch of sales and they want the game to die off fast is absurd for a couple reasons. Just consider how well Battlefield 4 was supported years after launch. EA does not continue game support past launch because they are moral and kind people who just want us to have a good time. The fact is that it's simply the most economically sensible thing to do at this point in time. Let's just take a look at this logically. We'll simply first assume that developers and publishers, especially EA and DICE, know in fact how to sell games. I think this statement is really pretty self-evident. The two are immensely successful, and each of their publications usually sells an amount that surpasses each release prior. Let's just consider why DICE LA and EA chose to spend the money in supporting Battlefield 4 for a very long period of time, 3 years after launch. It was not because they felt guilty or bad for Battlefield 4's terrible launch. It's not because they wanted to reward the community, but it was because it was economically important. Sure, it did make up for the terrible launch, and sure, it did reward the community, but those two things are not the final aspect of their designs. It was important for them to be seen by the player as desiring to create a very playable game, which would be supported long after launch. More than anything else, this provides a sense of security to those that might want to play any of DICE's future titles, and helps encourage them to purchase more than one DICE game. Everywhere I look, I often see lots of accusations that EA and DICE are all money-grabbing corporate overlords who want to sell a bunch of copies and have the game quickly die off, so they don't have to pay the server bills. And you know they're half right. EAXX probably like making a bunch of money, but that's just fine by me, because then we get a game that entertains us for thousands of hours. However, and this is no insult, they're also pretty darn good at being money grabbers, and they do recognize the absolute importance of customer loyalty. They don't want you to just buy one game. That's simply not as profitable as they could be. They want you to keep buying each new game released each year, and this requires the consumer to have trust in the product. As a little aside related to this, when you accuse a YouTuber, such as LevelCap, of simply having an opinion or simply making a video on something just for the views or just because EA or DICE paid them for it, not only is it illegal for an influencer, as they're called, to take money from a corporation as compensation for presenting a certain set of views which the corporation will direct, getting caught doing so completely and utterly damages that person's credibility. Now, I'm sure there are some idiots out there, but a lot of people who are very big on YouTube are pretty good at what they're doing. The risk of losing all your credibility is usually simply not worth the small monetary gain from foisting an inaccurate or misguided, paid-for opinion onto your viewers. Now, obviously, some people are dumb enough to do that, as we have seen in the recent past, but most of them are not. Anyhow, back to the original topic. So, game longevity. Though it does cost EA and DICE more in server expenses, it simply pays itself off when they get customers that return year after year to buy the new game. I mentioned LevelCap's video earlier, and for those of you that didn't watch it, his point's really pretty simple. His assertion was that Battlefield 1 lacks a certain amount of longevity as a result of its very shallow progression system, wherein the last gameplay unlock can be obtained in under 50 hours of play. His statement is correct, but for entirely the wrong reasons. I am also concerned when it comes to Battlefield 1's longevity, but I don't believe progression, or at least Battlefield 1's progression system, flawed as it is, has much of anything to do with it. There are other factors which are much more important. I believe that the progression system is probably the least among those. Let's just consider a few things. The first is that Battlefield 1's progression is basically no different than the system we had in prior titles, Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4. Progression in this sense, we refer to it as something to show off in-game. It is something that you can show to other players that is indicative of your investment, be it in time or the acquisition of skill. The Battlefield 1's medal system does not fill this role, as they can't be shown off readily in the game. The Battlefield 1 weapon-specific dog tags do fill this role, because they show how many kills you have with a certain weapon. You can run around with a tag that says that you have 10,000 Model 8 kills, or whatever. This is especially true because these dog tags and their corresponding service stars are visible on the kill cam, which means that you can easily and readily show them to other players on the server. Now, the only thing Battlefield 4 had that Battlefield 1 does not are the Mastery dog tags, but you could only show off one of these at a time. In that sense, it's pretty much identical to Battlefield 1. Battlefield 1 has a dog tag which is unlocked at, I don't know, it's either 10 or 100 kills, doesn't matter. Regardless, it still shows the number of total kills you have with that weapon, and so they basically serve the same purpose as Mastery dog tags did in Battlefield 4, because you can only show off one at a time. I mean, no one's gonna go look at someone's profile and see that they have all the Mastery dog tags. That was really kind of a small portion. Sure, it was something that you could work toward, but I mean, you can just as easily set a goal for yourself. I'm gonna get 500 kills with every weapon. And someone who's actively visiting your profile for whatever reason isn't going to see anything different. They're still gonna see that you have 5 service stars with every weapon instead of having all the Mastery dog tags. They really didn't have much value at all because it was almost impossible to tell if someone really had them or not, and you couldn't readily show that off. Battlefield 3 had a system that was basically identical to Battlefield 4. You had Mastery dog tags, but you could only show off one at a time, so it wasn't like you could see that someone had every single weapon with 500 kills. Now, so my argument that is somewhat the basis of the assertions I've made just now is that progression that can't be shown off isn't really all that valuable. Most people don't care about progression for the sake of progression, but mostly because they can show it off. They can show it to other players, and everybody can know that they have a certain amount of time investment, or they exist with X skill in a game. I have absolutely no proof for this. This is just anecdotal experience over several years of gaming. If anyone wants to dispute this point, because admittedly it is pretty weak, please leave a comment or direct message me on Twitter. Now, so what is the problem? Why do I think that Battlefield 1 has limited progression? Well, I can tell you what it isn't. It's not the gunplay. The gameplay is to some extent the problem. High-level players, as well as myself, find that the melee and bayonet system are rather disappointing and don't lend themselves to rewarding gameplay. We'll get to why catering to the very good players is important later on in the video. So while there are certain aspects of the gameplay that I think need work, the gunplay itself is not something that will turn away high-level players once they realize its depth. The gunplay is really a great representation of perfect German engineering. It's very heavily engineered, and the more you look at it, the more you realize that everything in this game, when it comes to the gunplay, makes a lot of sense mathematically. Anyway, towards the beginning of Battlefield 1, a lot of people were complaining about it because, as I said before, they didn't know how to use the guns. This game certainly has a higher skill floor than prior games have, and people mistook that higher skill floor for a lower one, which is surprisingly easy to do. At launch, people said that the self-loading rifles were completely unusable. These complaints pretty much died off completely when people realized that it was they who were bad, not the game. Currently, we have a large amount of whining regarding the Martini Henry. I think once the dust settles, people will still realize that the Martini Henry has an enormous sweet spot, which is very close compared to the other rifles, and they'll just learn to hit the upper chest, which is still the largest individual hitbox on a Battlefield 1 soldier. Something similar also occurred with the SMGs, and especially the LMGs. At launch, people said the SMGs were completely unusable, and now after they've practiced with some of the more accurate ones, such as the MP18, they realize that, nope, it was just they who were bad at using them. And once you get enough practice with them, they become very lethal. Light machine guns, according to the Battlefield community, were terrible when the game was first released, and then people figured out how to use them, and by now it's probably the most popular weapon class I see being used. So since it's not the gunplay, and it's not the progression, What is it? There are two things which I think are the most impactful for Battlefield 1's longevity. The first that we don't have in Battlefield 1 that we did in Battlefield 4 is a sense of community in servers. Private servers are completely kill. The ability to manage them is no more, and since the specific way a server was managed was often what drew or turned away community members, they're kind of completely pointless right now. You see, private servers were, in Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 3, they were more than just a central hub to send information from IPs back and forth. Named servers gained a reputation of their own, and they tended to attract a certain audience based on that reputation. Communities formed completely organically in Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 3 because some players liked the experience of playing on a particular server, so they keep coming back each week. This leads to a group of regulars which tend to influence the server and its gameplay as a whole. Ranked servers are always harder to play on compared to official servers, and for very good reason. Some servers were popular specifically because they encouraged teamwork and made for a more interesting and dynamic and, some would say, harder experience. In Battlefield 3, Pure came to mind as a community which readily encouraged VoIP use between squad mates and was very good at doing so. AOD servers late in Battlefield 4 were great for welcoming high-level players. They were one of the few ranked servers who recognized competitive players and did not ban them for being good. I think this is one of the biggest things that Battlefield 4 had that Battlefield 1 did not have that will influence whether it lives like Battlefield 4 did or if it dies off like Hardline. Now I want to cover some things that technically existed in prior titles, but could be improved in Battlefield 1 to further extend its lifespan. Battlefield's progression has always been kind of weak. Now, progression itself isn't the most important bit of the things that I'm about to note, but having a proper system will do great things for the game's extended value. We can look to Hardline and what it did well for examples of what can be brought to the main Battlefield franchise. Hardline had very long and intensive assignments for aesthetic items which could be readily shown off. The gold lead pipe comes to mind as an example. That thing took me more than several hundred hours to unlock, and the reward was quite worth it. I got a gold lead pipe. It was a great melee weapon. But then they killed off Hardline's character and it wasn't fun to play anymore. The point is that it's not just about showing how long you've played the game, it's not just about your rank, but how competently you can play it. The gold weapons and the syndicate assignments were really good for this. Now, one thing that Hardline did really well, and I really liked the inclusion of this, not because it was in Hardline, because it was indicative of the fact that maybe it could be brought into another game, is officially supported competitive. If there's anything Battlefield desperately really needs, it's competitive. And competitive isn't just for the high-level players, as I've discussed before, and will do so a little bit in this video. When discussing competitive in Battlefield 4, I like to reference a little document by Rilla, and in particular I want to make note of and quote from what he calls the Scream effect. If the game possesses players who symbolize an absolute mastery of high-level gameplay, it will bring hype over the game itself. I'm convinced that someone like Scream, the CSGO player famous for his headshot aim, did something the most rewarded CSGO players in the world didn't do. He convinced a lot of people that CSGO head aiming could be mastered at an insane level. And that's something extremely important, because he gave many newcomers a reason to trust the game. He was living proof, or lie, it doesn't matter, that you could trust the effect of hard training over your aim in CSGO, and that you could get recognized for it. That hard work on a skill-based gameplay could pay off in Counter-Strike, and this trust in the game, and the possibility to rise above everyone by tryharding, to shine through talent, is what brings numerous players to get interested into a competitive scene, and into the game in which it takes place. This little bit really does, I feel, summarize the importance of, if you will, household name of players on the casual player base. You see, competitive is more than just something to have on the side to keep a niche community satisfied. The ideal is to make competitive modes understandable to the average player so that they can relate their experiences to what they see in closed tournaments. And so the average player, your average buyer, will see those tournaments and see, hey, this game rewards my time investment, so I want to play it. In fact, that's entirely the reason that I purchased CSGO in the first place. Now, the simple fact of the matter is that competitive in Battlefield cannot exist as it has before now and be taken seriously. The first problem is that there is no ladder. The unfortunate fact of life is that Battlefield has never had easily accessible competitive. You had to really know people who were well involved in the game, and even then it was a real difficulty to actually play any competitive matches. A more accessible way to do this is desperately needed. If you just consider the fact that the biggest multiplayer sellers in existence are those that can be played competitively very easily, I'm looking at CSGO, League, Dota. I'm convinced that these are so popular because people can see clearly with their own eyes that time investment in the game really can put you above the level of everyone else. It's not just that there needs to be a competitive mode, but the typical average experience in a game needs to somehow reflect what you'd expect to find in a high-level match, or the other way around. Obviously, Battlefield 1's 64-player Conquest does not work as competitive, and that is its central, staple mode. But what about a separate, but also easily accessed mode that people are aware of and relates to their experiences in Conquest or Rush, but can be adapted for a small player count? I have no idea what it is right now. I've discussed this before, but that's a topic for a huge separate video. Anyway, in order for competitive modes to work as intended towards extending the game's lifespan, it needs to be something that anyone at all can jump into without already having made connections into the community. People should just be able to click the button that says put me in a competitive mode, and they should be put in a competitive mode with players similar to their skill level. The ELO system is very flawed, especially in CSGO where it's a 5v5. And an ELO system would be more flawed in Battlefield 1, where it would be either 5v5 or 8v8, but still, it's better than nothing, and would still generally, on average, mostly some of the time, kind of put people into games with people of about their skill level, and that's what's important. On a final, somewhat happier note, there are rumors of officially supported competitive modes and private servers with full control coming in 2017, but those statements are little more than rumors at that point, so I wouldn't hope for anything.